Sometimes, even to veteran players, +1/+1 counters can seem like an almost recent development in Magic's gameplay, and that's due to a few factors. For one, a quick search through the history of competitive play shows that no cards that grant +1/+1 counters were banned, restricted, or even included in too many popular decks for almost the entirety of the game's existence until the mid-2010s, with the notable exception of Spike Feeder and a couple of other cards. Second of all, though, in those aforementioned mid-2010s, Wizards not only began experimenting with +1/+1 counter mechanics like Evolve, Monstrous, and Adapt, but we were also given creatures like Winding Constrictor, Hangerback Walker, and Walking Ballista along with hardened scales to really push what the +1/+1 counter decks could do. This makes it seem like MTG history is kind of backloaded with counter strategies, which in turn makes +1/+1 counters seem like a recent addition to the game to some players. And finally, to some players, +1/+1 counters just seem like too technological to have been involved in the game's earliest days. But no, some of the most beloved fan favorites from as far back as Alpha Edition have placed +1/+1 counters on creatures like Fungusar, Rock Hydra, and Singer Vampire. And then a couple of years past that, in Antiquities, we get Triskelion, one of the most beloved +1/+1 counter creatures of all time. So counters are a mechanic that goes all the way back to the creation of the game. They just didn't get much press until Sneck and Friends came along a few short years ago. But now that Conclave Mentor has hit the streets, we have an official sequel to the Snake deck. But will it be as bad as Anaconda 2? Let's talk about it. What's up, Wizards? It's Dev and Ziggy here, getting some chin scratches. We're from SBMTG. We like it a Magic. And today, we're going to look at a Winding Constrictor deck. Oh, I mean a Conclave Mentor deck. I know, they're not exactly the same card because Mentor can't put counters on you, but we don't care. In this environment, there's no energy counters or anything, so whatever. You could actually argue that in this standard environment, Mentor is better than Constrictor because at least it gains you some life when it blows up. But the whole reason that we built the deck is obviously the ability that they have in common. Plus, the flavor makes more sense to me for what that's worth, and I know that's worth something to some people, so I'll go through it real quick. Conclave Mentor makes perfect sense. Whenever your creatures get counters, they mentor under Conclave Mentor, which makes perfect sense too, because there's already an ability that works with +1/+1 counters called Mentor. I see what you're doing, Wizards. It teaches your other creatures the secrets of getting extra counters, whereas the snake does what? How does a snake give people extra I don't understand that, but Conclave Mentor definitely wins the flavor war there. But does it win the war of the better standard deck? Not sure, but this is still a really, really good standard deck because Wizards has given us all kinds of amazing things that work with counters right now. Matter of fact, they've given us so much stuff that works with +1/+1 counters. This deck is nowhere near as much of a no-brainer to build as I initially thought it was going to be. I had to leave a lot of stuff out for spatial reasons here, determine what the better cards were. And at the end of the day, there were a lot of cuts to make. So I'm going to do a little bit at the end of the video where I talk about the things I didn't play and why. But for now, I'm going to kind of go through in order of all the things that were, most important to include in the deck, in my experience at least. So that begs the question, what is the second most important card in the deck next to Conclave Mentor? Well, it's actually another 2-drop. That's Watley's Raptor. Seriously, I do think this is the second most important card in the deck, and I know that it looks like it steps on Conclave Mentor's toes a little bit, but you don't often want to play this on turn 2. Very often it's an amazing top deck, or it's a great turn 3 or 4 play once you've started to get things set up. Matter of fact, the earlier you play Watley's Raptor in the game, the worse it usually is. Once you have Conclave Mentor and a couple of other creatures down with +1/+1 counters on them, then you'll play Watley's Raptor, and suddenly all your creatures get 2 +1/+1 counters thanks to your Conclave Mentor. The proliferate on this can just get out of control if you've got a big enough board state, and this deck does actually create a large board state as early as turn 3 or 4. So this is just an amazing card for the deck, and sometimes it'll even come down on turn 2 if you've got no better play and help a 1-drop get bigger or something. But for the most part, you do want to save this until it's a huge Anthem effect a little bit later. But up next, Pelt Collector. Yeah, this card's coming this early in the deck because we need to get on board as quickly as possible. And Pelt Collector is pretty much the only 1-drop in the format that passively collects +1/+1 counters without us having to really invest more mana into it or tap it or anything. So Pelt Collector is an absolute must for the deck. And it works well with Conclave Mentor on turn 2 because it becomes a 3/3. Works pretty well with Watley's Raptor on turn 2 as well. That's not so bad. So there's just a lot of cool things about a turn 1 Pelt Collector in this deck that allow us to get on board and take the initiative in a game, which is very important for this deck. But there are some creatures in the deck, unlike this guy, that don't just naturally, well, collect +1/+1 counters. While these Raptor and Conclave Mentor are great examples of this, so we need other ways to put +1/+1 counters on our creatures, and the best way to do it in the whole deck is Venerated Loxodon, the most respected pachyderm in the business, and in this deck, it is serious. We can sometimes come down as early as turn 3 and put counters on a couple of creatures, but even if you draw it late, just like Quatley's Raptor, it's an amazing top deck. If you get this on turn 4, 5, 6, it can just give a whole gang of creatures counters, and sometimes 2 counters because Conclave Mentor. Of course, if you've got extra Conclave Mentors out, multiples of it, this will give your creatures even more counters. It doesn't guarantee your entire board counters or anything, but it will put counters on specific creatures that you need them on, whether you're trying to make creatures bigger or you're trying to bestow counters to creatures in the first place. Venerated Loxodon does all of that while also providing a body. But a lot of our other cards work to put +1/+1 counters on creatures, whether they naturally get them, or we're just putting counters on creatures that already have them, because more of a good thing is usually good. So I'm also playing 2 copies of Basri Ket in this deck, which kind of surprises me. I was just playing 1 copy of Basri to start things off, but quickly realized this card is actually quite good. For one, it works really well on curve with Conclave Mentor. You play Conclave Mentor turn 2, turn 3 you play Basri, put a counter on it, and suddenly you got a 4/4 Mentor. Not bad, but there's also games where you go turn 1 Pelt Collector, turn 2 2 drop, whatever, and then turn 3 Basri Ket, and you can go ahead and minus Basri and start swinging with a lot of creatures relatively early in the game. That's amazing if you win first, but it's also good, just like some of the other cards in the deck, as a top deck, because if you're planning on swinging with like 4, 5, 6 creatures in a stalemate, then suddenly this makes that far, far more worth it because you get a bunch of other swinging dudes to go along. But speaking of Basri, we're also inviting the Lieutenant to the party because it's got a lot of work to do in this deck. This can put +1/+1 counters on creatures, often multiple +1/+1 counters on creatures if you've got that Conclave Mentor out. And it's a great form of sweeper protection if the opponent does draw that Shadow the Sky or whatever just to wipe the board. Well, suddenly we get a whole bunch of 2/2s, which is really sweet. Plus this has Pro Multicolored. There's just all kinds of things to like about this card. Even if it puts the counter on itself, it's suddenly like pretty big for the mana cost, and it's got a gang of abilities too, and if your opponent wipes it out, it replaces itself. So this is just an amazing form of sweeper protection. Thing is though, I'm only including a couple of copies because I don't want to get the top end of the curve too stacked up, and we're not going to be playing against sweepers in every game, and that's where this card shines the most. We'll see a couple more in the sideboard, but in the main deck I don't think we need more than a couple. But up next we got a card that can guarantee a +1/+1 counter for each and every one of our creatures and is also sweeper protection. So I'm playing 2 copies of Unbreakable Formation in the main deck. I went down on 1 copy of this in order to include a copy of the Basri Planeswalker, a 2nd copy of the Basri Planeswalker, and sometimes I do miss that 3rd copy of Unbreakable because this can sometimes just win the game when drawn. No matter when you draw it on turn 4, it can sometimes win the game, but especially if you draw it on turn 8 or 9. That is curtains a lot of the times, because this gives you an entirely consequence-free, vigilant, indestructible attack step, while also putting counters on all of your creatures if you cast it during your main step. That's just really insane in a deck where you're basically, if you have a Mentor out, guaranteed to be making each and every one of your creatures super freaking swole. So aside from that, the indestructibility is amazing for making sure that you get in swings that effectively guarantee you win the game. But if you do have to use it defensively, your opponent draws Shadow the Sky or something like that, then it's amazing to have in those situations too. Often you don't want to hold up 3 mana on a lot of your turns, but if you do sniff out a board wipe, keep those 3 mana up because Unbreakable Formation will win you the game in those situations too. Up next, in the 2-drop slot, a couple of copies of Skoos here. Scavenging Ooze will put counters on itself at some point in the game. Whether you have to use Basri's Lieutenant or Venerated Loxodon or something like that, you can go that route, but it's not going to be too hard for a creature to land in either graveyard, and then suddenly just 1 Skoos activation makes it a 4/4 if you got a Mentor out. If you got multiple Mentors, 1 Skoos activation makes it huge immediately, so that's good enough, but very often Scavenging Ooze can become the biggest creature on the table if there's a lot of different combat interactions going on. I've gotten Scavenging Ooze north of 10 power a few times while, building this deck, and also sniping Euros and stuff out of the opponent's yard, and all kinds of things too. Even if this doesn't pick up a creature, it can get rid of a Teferi from your opponent's graveyard so they can't Elspeth Conquers Death the thing back. There's a lot that Skooz does in this format because there's a lot people are doing with their graveyards. And Skooz often shows up in decks that don't even have a +1/+1 counter theme, so in this deck, it's supercharged. But back to the 3-drop slot, we'll clean things up there by playing 4 copies of Knight of Autumn, which is an all-star. We're getting to the last cards in the main deck here, and I said I was going in order of importance. So this kind of makes it seem like this and the next couple of cards aren't important, but it turns out every card in this deck is very good. It's kind of hard to rank what the better cards in the deck are sometimes, because they all do so much work, and Knight of Autumn is different. Sometimes this won't get counters on it, but it will blow up a Witch's Oven or a Wilderness Reclamation or a Cavalcade of Calamity or all kinds of other things. Sometimes it'll come down and kill an Embercleave that hasn't killed you yet. That can be really important in the aggro matchups too. So the one ability on this that blows up artifacts and enchantments just already has so much work to do in this format. But if you need to, aggro hasn't gotten the Embercleave yet, but they have depleted your life total. If you need to gain the life, it's there for you. But often you just want to put counters on it because turn 2 Mentor into turn 3 Knight of Autumn gives you a 5-power thing on turn 3, which isn't bad, but I'm telling you right now, don't hesitate to pull the trigger on the Destroy a Thing ability, because very often it's one of the most important parts of the card. But, if you have to settle for a turn 3 5/4, that's not so bad either. Up next, let's talk about Stonecoil Steve Austin, all 4 copies of this thing, because it's just unbelievable. It shows up in a bunch of decks, again, just like the last couple of cards we talked about, that don't even really have anything to do with +1/+1 counter strategies, so it's going to go in this deck. This thing has shown up in everything from mono black aggro to Teamer in some iterations. I mean, it's just kind of everywhere right now, because it gets around Teferi and a bunch of other removal spells and planeswalkers in this format, plus it tramples, which is incredibly important if we're going to stack counters on it. And we can play it pretty much anywhere on curve. That means if we don't have a 1-drop, but we do have a Watley's Raptor or a Conclave Mentor or something, then we at least can play something on turn 1 to get that board state going and start putting counters on the Stonecoil later in the game. Could happen, but if we don't have a 2 or a 3 or a 4-drop, it also fills those holes in the curve. And if we top deck it late, which you may notice is a trend with a lot of the cards in this deck, then it's really at its best. If you can play a 6/6 Stonecoil Serpent and then start increasing the number of counters on it, it only gets better. Plus, in this deck, again, as long as you've got a Conclave Mentor down, you're always paying above rate or really below rate for a Stonecoil Serpent. You don't mind paying 4 mana for a 5/5 pretty much ever. But the final creature in the deck is a Hydra, but it's not Wildwood Scourge. We'll get to that. Instead, I'm playing Voracious Hydra in this deck because we really don't have a whole lot of main deck removal in this thing, and you're gonna need removal, son, I promise you. We can take out artifacts and enchantments and whatnot, but when it comes to facing down other creatures on the other side of the table, that's when things can get a little bit hairy depending on who got the better start, who went first, whose board state is faster. All of these things matter, so sometimes even just a 3/4 Voracious Hydra can come down and kill a very important creature on the other side of the table. And with Conclave Mentor pumping counters into it, you don't have to pay too much mana to actually bust up another creature on the other side of the board. But, again, if you're playing against decks that don't play too many creatures, it just comes down and you double the number of counters on it, and just like Stonecoil Serpent, it importantly has trample. When it comes to cards like Wildwood Scourge, looks really, really good and can get huge over the course of a game. I experimented with the card, don't get me wrong. It was part of the labbing for the deck, but, doesn't have trample. That kind of sucks. So, cards like Voracious Hydra that get big, in the same ways sometimes that Scourge gets big. Scourge gets counters whenever any of our creatures get counters, but we can still put extra counters on Voracious Hydra through Basri's Lieutenant, or Unbreakable Formation, or Venerable Loxodon. There's Watley's Raptor. There's tons of ways to put extra counters on Voracious Hydra once it is in play, and it can just be a huge, trampling, impossible to block thing. Or it can kill a creature, and that is very often what you're going to do with it. Conclave Mentor effectively decreases the cost of Voracious Hydra for what that's worth, and it's worth an awful lot. You'll be very happy to draw Voracious Hydra on turn 5 when you do. But let's look at the mana base here, and it's actually fairly simple. Just 4 Temple Garden, 4 Temple of Plenty in terms of multicolored dual lands and whatnot. And then we've got 2 Castle Ardenvale, 6 Plains, and 8 Forests. That's it. You could include Garen Brigand here, and it might not be bad with so many Stonecoil Serpents and Voracious Hydras and whatnot. But I just didn't want too many tap lands because so much of our action takes place on turn 2 and 3 that I didn't want to be hindered in that way. That said, Garen Brig could be very good in the later games, so you might want to give it a try, but I just wanted to create tokens with extra mana rather than use extra mana to play bigger creatures. Now let's take a look at the board real quick, and we've got some redundancies in the board thanks to a couple of copies of Unbreakable Formation and another 2 of Basri's Lieutenant. We're just going to make the 4 of these cards whenever we play against board wipes, and that's pretty much all I have to say about that. You need these when you play against Shatter and other things, so you put those in games 2 and 3 if you're playing best of 3. Aside from that, let's move to aggro. We're playing against aggro. I'm playing a few copies of Swallow Whole. This not only puts counters on stuff, but it is a 1 mana removal spell, which is really sweet. It also exiles. Just so many cool things that Swallow Whole does that I actually considered a 2 of in the main deck, but just couldn't find room for it. But when we know we're playing against other creature-based fast decks, Swallow Whole can be amazing because it usually allows us to play it and another spell on our turn, and that can usually just signal the end of the game right there. Aside from that, I'm playing Conclave Tribunal, mostly so we can clean up problem permanents no matter what they are, creatures, planeswalkers, enchantments, whatever. Conclave Tribunal's got our back, and we're playing enough creatures to effectively cast it for less. Aside from that, Jim Razor will come in against artifacts and enchantments. We've already got Knight of Autumn in the deck and Conclave Tribunal in the sideboard to clean up these problem permanent types, but Jim Razor is too tempting with cards like Voracious Hydra and Stonecoil Serpent. I wanted to include some copies of it somewhere in the deck, so here you go. If you want more busting up of artifacts and enchantments, Jim is truly outrageous. Aside from that, a couple of copies of Ajani the Great-Hearted found its way into the sideboard, but not the main deck. Again, I just could not find slots for this, and I felt like Basri's Lieutenant was a better card, and I couldn't find all the slots for Lieutenant that I wanted to find, so Ajani didn't end up in the main deck. But just like Lieutenant can be great against sweepers and control matchups and whatnot, Ajani can be great in aggro matchups. If we're trying to get over on, smaller, faster decks and whatnot, this can not only gain us life, but grant our creatures vigilance for more consequence-free swings, and also, the best part about it, obviously, blanket our creatures with counters, sometimes giving them 2 +1/+1 counters, depending on whether or not we have a mentor. So, yes, this card looks good enough to be in the main deck, but we didn't have all the slots for 4-drops, and I honestly felt like Basri's Lieutenant and even Venerated Loxodon and Stonecoil Serpent are better turn 4 plays than Ajani in most games. But if you're playing against hardline aggro, you know what to do once you get to game 2. Aside from that, 2 copies of Sorcerous Spyglass to finish things off on the board here. This I'm only really including as a haymaker against Ugin decks, because especially against the Simic Ugin decks, if you get down a Sorcerous Spyglass before they play their Ugin, that's effectively a KO. There's not much they can do about that aside from the occasional Brazen Borrower, and sometimes they can finish the game by stealing all your stuff with a mass manipulation, but Sorcerer's Spyglass still takes out their one big play they built their entire deck for, and it will force scoops on occasion in game 2. Now, earlier I briefly touched on why I wasn't playing Wildwood Scourge, but there are a couple of other things I didn't end up on here that I think you could at least consider if you wanted to get really spicy. Like, Zhang Yanggu is a really good idea in this deck, but I think most of the 3-drops that we're playing, if not all, are just better in form than this card, and if you were going to play Zhang, your deck would probably look a little bit different. Maybe include New Horizons as well to ramp into some big stuff. We're already playing Voracious Hydra, already playing Stonecoil Serpent, some decks already play Wildwood Scourge, so with all these big X-cost things, the ramp that we get off of Zhang Yanggu actually looks pretty good, and if nothing else, it at least puts +1/+1 counters on creatures. So turn 2 Mentor into turn 3 Zhang Yanggu, make the Mentor 4/4. This all looks decent, but I'm not sure that it's actually up to snuff. Aside from that, there's a really cool idea of making Giganta your companion and including Chamber Sentry in this deck, and usually I jump at the opportunity to include Chamber Sentry in any deck, but I'm fairly certain what's going to happen 90% of the time here is that you don't get to include Basri, you don't get to include Voracious Hydra, and for that trade-off you get a creature they're almost certainly going to kill before it can tap to bring a Chamber Sentry back. You also have to play a creature like Chamber Sentry, which I hate to say this, but just is not as good as any of the other creatures that we're playing in the deck. It does represent a form of removal that we don't have access to already, so I can see where, paying 2 mana for a Chamber Sentry that comes into play as is a 3/3 and can bolt a thing sounds attractive, but this is a really, really large mana investment to actually get it to shoot stuff down. And at the end of the day, I just think the cards we're playing are better. But here are your power rankings right here. Final score of 66, and the deck actually isn't super expensive to play. I think it's hovering around the $100 mark. If you click on the link in the description, it'll probably say more than that, but that's because the default basic lands that they're using right now are like the $5 basics, so that throws the prices out of whack. But I'm pretty sure that there's nothing super duper expensive in this deck that really takes up all of your money, especially when you're talking about what it costs to really build a workable, functioning standard deck right now. And this does have game against all kinds of things. Sometimes it can kill the team of Reclamation decks and even the more control-y blue-white or Bant decks before they really get to establish the things they're trying to do before it gets too late in the game. Sometimes this can either outright kill those decks, or it can survive sweepers like Shatter the Sky in a number of ways that we've already talked about. So check that box if you get the right start. But, you know, against decks like Mono Red and the more popular Mono Black builds that are cropping up right now, those aggro matchups, very often, again, especially if we go first and we get to establish our board presence with a decent start, then we can just go way above those decks because we play nearly as fast as they do with the correct start, and our creatures get far bigger than theirs over the course of a game. There's been a couple of times playing against Mono Red and Gruul Aggro in the lab where our creatures get way bigger than an Embercleave can even handle. It's happened a few times. All in all, though, this strikes me as a fair deck that has decent game against most of the matchups right now in the format. It can win, but it can also lose, especially depending on what the start looks like. Because if you don't get a Conclave Mentor on turn 2, the deck obviously takes a bit of a hit. But for every game where you don't draw Mentor in your opener, or it gets killed by Shock on turn 2 or something, you're going to have another game where you just explode onto the board with like Pelt Collector into Mentor into literally any 3-drop, and a Venerated locks it on, and suddenly things are insane. So the deck is a lot of fun to play and can take a lot of other decks by surprise with how fast it can develop its board state. So try this thing out. It's pretty cheap to do so, and honestly, we're probably not going to see a thing as powerful as Conclave Mentor working with +1/+1 counters in Standard for a good long time, so get it while it's hot. And if you wanted to try it out, you could always check that link in the description, go over to TCG Player, order anything from there that you need, and you'll be helping your dude out. And again, they got the lowest prices on the internet. That's why I work with them. So if you want the deck, order through there, or just craft the thing up on Arena and see how well you do, because the games where the deck gets the cards that it wants to in the early game, it feels literally unbeatable in some matchups. But that said, end of the day, I feel like the deck is fair, but sometimes that's what makes Magic fun. So give this thing a shot. I hope that you like it. If you enjoyed +1/+1 counters, I think it's probably your best shot at having fun in Standard right now. So try that out, and then do all the other YouTube stuff. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications for more Deck Techs gameplay, top 10 lists. I got a top 10 list coming up later this week that I'm actually really, really excited about. Make sure you hit the bell for those notes. But aside from that, just check out the Patreon. $1 a month to vote on what content you want to see, and just support the channel. I need that. Aside from that, I guess I'm pretty much done with this. Just let me know how you felt about all the decisions down there. Should we play Wildwood Scourge instead of Voracious Hydra? That might be hotly debated, but there's a bunch of stuff I left out. Growth Chamber Guardian and no other adapt stuff actually went into this deck at all. By the way, if you were going to build the Zhang Yang Yu deck, you go ahead and play Incubation Druid, speaking of adapt things. But anyway, I did leave a lot of stuff out, so let's talk about it down there in the comments section. Get down there. But anyway, aside from that, I'm done, so I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.